Hello Advanced Higher Historians and welcome to 1905, not the year because that would be weird, but because obviously 1905 is the next lesson that we are looking at. The 1905 revolution is possibly one of my favourite bits from the early part of the topic because it is the revolution that never was, but kind of like the foundation of what would later come in February and October 1917. So it's the first revolution that Russia really kind of has, but like I said, it is the revolution that never was because it never actually becomes a full-blown revolution, which will make much more sense when we talk about it in a bit more detail. So, learning intention, again, we're still thinking about this idea of why the Tsarist regime ultimately collapsed, and again, our context is still Russia and revolution, which is our first subtopic. 2 success criteria points. 1, I want you to know what the causes and the consequences of the 1905 revolution were, so that's kind of 2, so it's a bit of a cheat, and I want you to be able to explain why you think the Tsar ultimately survived. Reading assignment for this particular lesson is chapter 2 of our textbook, which is pages 28 to 45, so it's quite a sort of a hefty bit of the textbook, but a lot of good information there that you can use and that we can look at. I'm going to give you one task that you kind of have to do with this lesson this week to upload. The rest of the tasks in the PowerPoint are just for your notes and for your understanding, so you can work through those at your own pace, that's fine. And I'm also going to upload probably on Monday or Tuesday, probably Tuesday next week, the next task for the week as well, which is going to be a documentary for you to watch and some questions, and that's the only thing that I'm going to ask you to actually upload this week going forward, because there's a lot to kind of do with this. So just a kind of wee recap of what we've talked about in the state of Russia so far. Most peasants at this point in time are still paying the redemption payments imposed in return for the land that they were given when they became free, so they're no longer indentured servants, they're no longer bond servants, they're not serfs anymore, they're free peasants, and this land is supposed to then be theirs to work on, but they're having to pay redemption payments for it. They farm smaller land holdings than they had before they were emancipated. The nobles keep the best lands for themselves, which means the peasants are working on the poor soil in Russia. Farming practices haven't evolved very much since the Middle Ages, so they're still using old-fashioned crop rotation and things like that, and not really any machinery. They couldn't leave their village without the permission of the mer, which is the word for the whole community, so they weren't ever really free, to be honest. Many town workers earned barely enough to survive from one week to the next. The gap between the rich and the poor peasants are getting bigger. The richer peasants, or the kulaks, are gaining more land and running local businesses, and they're becoming kind of a hated class of peasants. Factory hours in the cities are not regulated by the state until Sergei Witt introduces this 11.5-hour working day in 1897. However, this law is quite often ignored, and obviously when he leaves, well, he doesn't leave, he gets assassinated, but when he dies, they tend to just ignore it completely. The factories are supposed to be inspected regularly, but rules in health and safety are not followed, so it's not great. The rapid growth of the towns means that the workers are living in really overcrowded, very unsanitary tenements and conditions. It's not a particularly great situation. 5 or 6 people to one room sort of living conditions, very limited sort of sanitary things and stuff as well. It's not a particularly nice situation to be living in. Health and education services are very poor, which creates quite a lot of more social inequality. The people are not able to read or write. Again, they're not then able to move up in other skilled sort of labour jobs, and they're stuck with this kind of manual toil in the factories or on the land if they're peasants. The life expectancy in Russia is under 32 years at best. 32 is kind of what you're looking at. It's under 30 in general for the most people, and you'd be working pretty much all of that. And many peasants are basically coming into the towns to earn extra money when they're not needed for the sowing and harvesting. So it's creating a second class of people, these urbanites, these people coming into the cities, who are then either staying there and working there and sending money back home to the rural areas, or they're then going back and coming back and forward in this kind of migration pattern that they have going on. So Russia's not in a great situation, not in a great state. Remember, the autocracy is still in place. Nicholas is not doing well as the Tsar. He is not fit to run a village post office, and you've looked at why this might have been. So we're thinking about why the people would have started to want change at this point. So at the beginning of the 20th century, Russia's unsettled, it's quite volatile, there's an economic depression after the 1900s, and then you've got this Russo-Japanese war that we've mentioned as well happening in 1904, which is not going particularly well, and again we will come back to that in a little bit more detail. Opposition to the Tsar is growing stronger as things progress in 1904, especially the more and more that the Russian army and the navy are finding themselves coming against losing battles, continuously losing battles. At the beginning of 1905, when feelings are running particularly high, protesters end up being murdered in an event that becomes known as Bloody Sunday, which leads to a mass explosion of popular discontent. Pretty much what Nicholas had done at his coronation, where it was deemed unnecessary to disperse the crowd through any other version of events than force, he then actually did the same thing at a popular demonstration on Bloody Sunday. Then for over a year, so between 1905 and 1906, the state is pretty much out of control, and the Tsar faces pretty much just annihilation, destruction, and a very definite fall from grace. But he doesn't. When the dust settles, Nicholas is still firmly in control of Russia and very much at the very top of the pyramid. He survives this because of the loyalty of the army staying on his side and the agreement to make concessions. However, what has happened and what he cannot change is a fundamental shift in the way that the people of Russia actually view him and view the autocracy in general. So the concessions are literally his lifeline. It's a bungee cord that he has managed to grab hold of in free fall, and it's the only thing that is saving him. Unfortunately for him and for the people, what actually follows is not a series of concessions and a modernisation of Russia, but rather a brutal suppression that will forever alter the relationship between the Tsar and between him and his people. So it's not a particularly great situation, and you can see this as the kind of fundamental foundation of discontent, which then will later lead to revolution in February 1917. But he does manage to get eke a few more years out of it from this point. So the Russian government attempted to deal with its problems and pretty much dramatically failed. There are a few different factors that push Russia into revolution in 1905. It's the rapid social and economic change that's happening, the economic depression which Russia ends up going through, the failure of the government to improve the worker conditions and to adhere to its factory hours and situational things that he had tried to put in place. The chaos that was the Russo-Japanese War, which was supposed to be Nicholas's saving grace to try and focus people's attention away from all these things that we've talked about and get them on his side, but because he failed miserably as a leader in the military, they were losing, so that adds to stress and discontent. And then the increasing opposition from this new liberal intelligentsia group who are starting to think about where they actually ally themselves politically. It's almost as if this new group, educated and suddenly realising that their life is not particularly great in Russia, decide that they want things. It's like they've developed a political compass, which is an idea I'll come back to. So your first task is to pause the video at roughly about 10 minutes in and using page 28 to 31 to make a mind map using these headings, the 5 headings that are there, and using the pages in the textbook to give you some mind maps about some information that you can use to explain why the 1905 revolution actually happened. So pause the video at roughly about 10 minutes and 30 seconds, complete this task, and then go back to the video. So you should have completed the first set of mind maps. You don't need to upload these or send them to me, but you just do need to do them for your notes, and we're moving on to think about the war in Japan in a wee bit more detail. So we know that this war is fought basically for control of Korea and Manchuria between 1904 and 1905. The Tsar expected a very quick victory against these, you know, pathetic and lesser mortals that were the people that he was fighting against. And this would silence his critics, because nothing unites a country better than a series of spectacular victories and war. I mean, it worked for Britain, so there we go. But ultimately it didn't quite work out that way, because Russia suffered a series of defeats on both land and sea instead, and Japan ended up destroying both the Pacific and the Baltic fleets, and they pretty much just annihilated Russia at this point in time. So ultimately the results of this, I don't know, I feel like I should put it up and play a little tune to see if you can guess. The results of this catastrophic defeat is 1. The Tsar becomes unpopular, even more so because the defeats humiliate Russia. It is humiliating to be defeated by Japan at this point in time, especially if you are a world superpower, which Russia is. 2, or B, his government has now been shown to be both weak and incompetent, because the people he is putting in positions are making some of the worst decisions in military history, never mind Russian military history, but military history in general. 2, the conditions for the working class people become worse because it increases prices and food shortages because you're at war, and the shortage of materials lead to factory closures and unemployment. And ultimately, when the war with Japan comes to an end, they are going to lose some of their areas and things like that of land, which again is not a very good thing. So this map shows the kind of overview of some of the defeats and things early on in the war. It started off in this top corner, not the war itself, but technically it did, in the top corner here, with a quarrel over the control of Manchuria and Korea, which is this part here. The kind of edge of Russia, if you will. Now, again, this is an area they're going to want to keep control of, because as you can sort of see, if I do in blue, you can see the Trans-Siberian Railway travelling kind of across this bit here. So this is kind of an area that they do want to keep control of, at least, and it links them to these other bits here as well. One of the things that Russia kind of really want is this bit here, Port Arthur, for the Pacific Sea, for the Pacific Fleet even, because it's an ice-free port, so they want Port Arthur, and they want control of that, which is one of the kind of main gains that they're looking to make. So January 1905, they end up having to surrender Port Arthur because they're just losing terribly. March 1905, they're then defeated a little bit further north here. By May 1905, the Russian Navy has been destroyed. So in the space of something like 4 or 5 months, it is kind of just a bit of a mess, realistically speaking. So the main causes of the 1905 revolution, basically, we have long-term discontent in each of the 5 groups: the intelligentsia, the revolutionaries, the national minorities, the peasants, and the workers, the urbanites, if you will. And the long-term discontent is what we've already looked at and talked about so far, plus the Tsarist regime and its economic policies. Then we've got the Russo-Japanese War acting as a catalyst, And then you've got the Bloody Sunday Massacre as the spark, which ultimately results in revolution. And there's a nice diagram in the textbook for you to kind of see there. So the long-term discontent point, we've got the intelligentsia feeling very alienated. The middle-class liberals really wanted to participate in government. They wanted some form of elected National Assembly. They wanted things to really be kind of more like a constitutional democracy, similar to what maybe Britain had, where the Tsar could stay. They were quite happy for him to stay, but they wanted more of a say. They wanted a political voice. And they're the ones that are starting to consider themselves, we'll call them political explorers. They suddenly have a political compass. They know where they are aligned on the political spectrum, and they want things, and they're not able to get it because of the situation. The revolutionaries, students at this point in time are protesting against how repressive the government controls are, because they're the educated ones that are out there either giving the revolutionary speeches or listening to them, and that's what's happening with them. The revolutionaries themselves, so like the socialist revolutionaries, they want peasant revolution, basically to create socialism based around the peasant sort of communes and things like that, which is very Marxist and very about the lower classes taking over and taking control. The Social Democrats at this point in time, the real Marxist, they are looking for an urban working class stage of revolution to create a socialist state, work through the whole socialist state element, and then transition it into communism. And if you go back to the textbook, there's that really lovely diagram that I really like because I'm a geek that way, but it's cool, with the diagram of how Marxism is supposed to work, and it's like train station sort of points. They're trying to follow that idea. You've also got the national minorities, like we've talked about, like the Finns, the Poles and the Jews. They are wanting more autonomy, they want more independence, they want Russification to end, and it's not going particularly great for them. Their issue is that they have to contend with the government policies with the Tsar. So the Tsarist regime is the thing that they're really reacting to, because the Tsar is weak and indecisive, the government is repressive, there is no move towards this constitutional government that they want. They're being denied basic freedoms like freedom of press, freedom of speech, the freedom to form political parties, which they very much want at this point in time. And there are no concessions to the nationalities. If they are protesting for autonomy, which in a lot of ways they feel that they should have, because they're not part of Russia, even though they've been conquered by them, any protests are being really very brutally repressed by the Okhrana and by the army. So those groups in particular, those top three, are finding the Tsarist regime itself to be really oppressive, and they're not particularly happy with that. On the other side of the sort of political groupings are the peasants and the workers, who are maybe not actually as concerned about the political ramifications of Russia and the Tsar, but what they're really thinking about is how they feel and how their lives are working. So there's a lot of grievances, including poverty being the first and foremost, for the peasants especially. They need more land, the taxes are far too high, the redemption payments on the land are ridiculous as far as they're concerned, and they can't afford to pay all of this money out. There are periodic famines happening, especially because they are working on land that is not great soil. It's not agriculturally the best area or arable land that they can grow on, because the landowners are keeping that land for themselves. So they are not particularly happy with that. Also, the peasant population is increasing, which is putting more and more pressure on the land. There's more mouths to feed, but there's more people to divide the land up too, and it's more pressure on the land to make goods that can be used to get money to pay for rent, but also can be used to actually feed the population as well. And that's not great. The workers, these urbanite idea people, they've got grievances as well, because their hours are long, their pay is low, the conditions are terrible for working in, the living conditions are actually potentially worse. Some people are actually working for 15 hours and then going to sleep in the factory, and someone is taking over from them, and then they're getting up and taking over, and they're just never leaving. They want more political power. Again, think back to higher Britain. it's kind of this idea that these people are starting to realise that they are the ones that are funding all of this, so why shouldn't they have more power and more control? Their grievance with the government is partly the Tsar, but they still kind of do love the Tsar because they've been not brainwashed but trained to think that from the church and from the way that the Tsarist regime works. But their main grievances is with the economic policies under Sergei Witt, which is this idea of industrialisation. Urban workers and peasants are basically being squeezed quite hard by the taxes and the low wages that this urbanisation and industrialisation project is taking, because it takes money to industrialise, and that's where they're trying to get the money from. The economic slump that hits Russia after 1900 and arguably never goes away. How Russia has an economy beyond this, I don't understand, but we'll talk about that in more detail later on. Anyway, this economic slump after the 1900s leads to quite a high level of unemployment. There's a lot of social tension in towns and things as well. People are starting to look for someone else that'll give them an out, give them a change. And then in 1900 and then again in 1902, the harvests were particularly poor, and starvation and riots for food ended up erupting as well, which is not particularly great and is not being dealt with effectively. A lot of peasants then leave the sort of rural areas to move to urban areas to try and get some sort of job for food, and they're finding the conditions are becoming even worse because it's becoming overcrowded as well. So that sort of first section gives you this really good idea of how awful the situation in Russia actually is. Then you've got the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War in February 1904, defeats on land and sea, shocking the Russian public, losing Port Arthur in January, the shortages of food and fuel and the high prices and the high levels of unemployment due to the war are not great, massive upsurge in discontent at the Tsar's government, and this idea that the Tsar, not so much the Tsar himself, and again that's a key point, but the Tsar's way of working is incompetent and it's not working, and the Duma is not working, and they want more. Some people did think it was the Tsar, others not so much. They start to protest. And one particular protest, led by a man called Father Gapon, started to march towards the Winter Palace on the 9th of January 1905, and it was a peaceful protest, a peaceful demonstration, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a minute or two. But there were women and children and things there, and they brought picnics and they were decked out in their Sunday best, and they brought pictures of the Tsar, and they genuinely just wanted to see the Tsar with this idea that he could fix their problems. They were convinced that the Tsar was their little god, and he could be made to understand if they could just see him. And unfortunately what ended up happening is that the demonstrators were fired on, and a lot of people were injured and killed, which turned the people completely against the Tsar. That acted as the spark to the catalyst, and then revolution was pretty much what followed. With his own people pretty much just not wanting to talk to him or even deal with him any longer. Strikes, peasant uprising, petitions, riots, mass demonstrations. The situation for the Tsar in general was just not particularly good, and 1905 became the revolutionary year. This is a really great diagram, by the way, if anybody wants to make a copy of it as the main cause as you can, but if you're happy with your mind maps, that's fine as well. So some historians actually still maintain that the revolution really began actually in 1904. One spark is the assassination of one of the ministers by the socialist revolutionaries. He was deeply unpopular, nobody really cared, so nobody mourned him, but it did allow for a kind of a flood of criticism against the government as a starting point. The opposition group activity then starts to increase when there's not really any backlash from this assassination, and the autocracy starts to look more and more fragile. Then in early November 1904, the Liberals decided that they were going to hold a Nationalism Vest, which is basically a district council, like a congress, and the government agreed, and the Congress agreed, and that was fine. And they demanded changes. They demanded civil liberties, they demanded rule of law, an extension of suffrage, a representative body that would help run the country, and they held secret political reform meetings, which they disguised as lavish dinner banquets, as you were wont to do in the early 1900s if you were political and living in a country where no political things were allowed. And the government did nothing. They didn't stop them, they didn't try to do anything. The press reported these events uncensored, which showed that the Tsar's stranglehold, or at least the stranglehold that Alexander had over the country, was loose under Nicholas. His grip wasn't maybe quite as tight as his father's had been. Obviously, like we said, the four things that ultimately set 1905 off was Bloody Sunday, which we've briefly mentioned, the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin, which is kind of important, the St. Petersburg Soviet, and the October Manifesto. So your next task is to use pages 33 to 36 to make notes under these four headings. Again, you can mind map them if you prefer, whatever you like. And there is a handout which gives you more information about Bloody Sunday and the October Manifesto as well, for you to add some detail there. So stop the video roughly at 26 and 30 seconds. Complete this task and then start the video back up again. Okay, so just more information now that you've completed that task about the role of the national minorities. They took advantage of the chaos and demanded autonomy or self-rule from the democratic government, and they demanded this end of Russification. The Poles and Finns demanded outright independence, the Jews demanded civil rights, and the protests began to turn violent on the edges of the empire. And basically what they had to do to try and keep it under control was send about 10,000 troops to these areas to try and control them, which if you are busy trying to fight a war is not a particularly good thing to do. In Poland, things grew significantly more worrisome when pupils and students get involved, followed by professional people in this kind of rioting and violence and things like that, which ultimately resulted in a threat of general civil war across Russia. And that should be 300,000 soldiers were then sent to prevent this, who were again pretty much needed to fight with this losing war in Japan, so you couldn't really afford to keep sending these soldiers. The Baltic states then followed. It's like this domino effect sort of thing, to the point where they were virtually in a civil war with the authorities by the summer of 1905. So the Tsar is effectively fighting two wars, the war against Japan and then the war against the situation that he is actually in as well. A crucial factor within this revolution itself is the army being the ones that kind of open fire on the peasants and the people protesting. It's really key to think that a lot of these people in this army actually were peasants. They're not actually happy at being asked to stop peasants themselves rebelling when they actually feel the same sort of way or they agree with it. So from later October to mid-December 1905, there are roughly about 200 mutinies in the army. They're small ones, basically things like holding meetings that they're not allowed to hold, talking back to an officer, disobeying orders, things that won't necessarily be a major issue, but again it's showing this idea that Nicholas is starting to lose some of the control that he has over his country. Soldiers in the Far East basically wanted to be demobilised after the war, are causing problems and just adding to it. Historians like Terry argue that this was because after the October Manifesto, where the Tsar had made concessions and agreed to things, they felt like the old rules and the systems no longer applied to them. It didn't apply to them at all, and that wasn't necessarily the case. There was supposed to be changes being made to give them more rights and maybe a little bit more authority over their lives, but not to this extent. John Bushell, he maintains, again, a different historian, that the soldiers mutinied at the point when they thought the regime had lost, but they repressed civilians when they thought the regime was back in charge. So they swung to whatever side they thought was going to be the winning side, and luckily for the Tsar, they generally agreed that it was going to be him at this point in time. The December 6th military reforms give them more pay, give them shorter service time, increased ration promises to them like tea, sugar, no more forced labour, and basically this brought them back on side to the Tsar and they remained loyal. And this is the thing that saves Nicholas. When the army stay loyal to him, even though he agrees to make these concessions and he doesn't, the fact that the army are being promised these things and are waiting for them means that they stay on side and are willing to repress people. The elite army and the Cossacks hadn't mutinied, and they were rewarded. They got money and privileges and things like that, and they were then asked to help restore order at the end of 1905, which cements this hatred of them. Meanwhile, the revolutionaries, the socialist revolutionaries, have some influence, but mostly they're impacted on the towns and the urban workers and the students. They're not really impacting the peasants, and they complained about it because they wanted this. The terrorist wing called for rural terror against landlords, so violence, arson, burn down the landlords, down with landlords, bad people in high places. The SDs, the Mensheviks in particular, were influenced by these larger factories and organised workers, but both sides were generally unprepared for revolution, and their activity shows that. So they were saying kind of things like, boo, down with landlords, and, up with the people, but they didn't really mean that to the extent that they were ready to take over. They didn't have any forward-moving plan, which limited the amount of revolutionary work that they could do. All of the sources at the time say that the revolutionary parties were just generally unprepared for the revolt that broke out in 1905. They knew that it was coming on the horizon, but they thought they'd probably have more time to plan for it. The workers and the peasants were apathetic and sometimes quite hostile towards them, so there's no way they're going to get them on side, and without the people on side they can't really host a full-scale revolution. They're irritated by this, and irritated with the sort of petty political squabbling that they can see happening in this growing political spectrum that they don't really have any understanding of. It would be kind of like going down to primary school level, to primary 1 or 2, and trying to explain to them how politics works. They don't really think it applies to them, they're not really interested, and they're more interested in listening to the local leaders who they felt understood their demands, understood their needs, and were actually going to do something for them. It's the what's in it for us sort of situation, and these socialist revolutionaries are not answering that call. The Mensheviks obviously play a significant role in the St. Petersburg Soviet, and they become basically the main party in it, they come to dominate it, but there are socialist revolutionaries and Bolshevik representatives in that as well. The Bolsheviks on the other side, they distrust independent working class bodies, and Lenin, who had recently returned from exile in early November, never spoke in the Soviet. The really interesting thing is that the main man at this point in time, the one who you see speaking, is Trotsky, who was deputy chairman and looked to spread revolution, but he was a Menshevik at this early point. He wasn't on the Bolshevik side. The Socialist Democrats and the Bolshevik parties were particularly active in organising and taking part in uprisings in November and December of 1905. So the question becomes, why did the Tsar ultimately survive? Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to use pages 40 to 42 in the textbook to create a table or something that's similar, sort of a mind map part. On the left hand side, you're going to list all of the different steps that the Tsar took to crush revolution. So on this side, all of the different steps, and on the right hand side you're going to take a note of the long-term measures that the Tsar took to keep control. So crushing revolution on this side and long-term measures on the other. So again, pause the video, roughly about 34-35, and complete the task. So in terms of interpreting 1905, what we think about it in general. Traditionally, historians have seen this 1905 revolution as a result of the impoverished and increasing misery of the workers, the peasants and things like that, just generally exasperated by the war, leading to a kind of explosion of popular discontent. Beryl Williams, who is a fabulous historian, and I really strongly suggest that you check her out online, put it into Google, she's got loads to say about this topic in this area. She argues that actually that's really simplistic and it's much more complicated than this. What she says is that it was a popular protest from a period of economic growth where the people were starting to realise, hang on a second, why don't we have more? And at the point where they realised that they wanted more, they realised they didn't have any way to ask for it. So rather than just it being miserable about what their conditions were like, it was a time where people's attitudes and society in general are undergoing an evolution. It's undergoing a rapid change point. And this is initiated then by a sudden depression and then a war. So they're asking for more freedom and change than economic things. They want more for themselves rather than for the economy. The Tsarist regime have managed to survive intact by the end of 1905, but society is no longer the same. The brutal way that this revolution has been quashed has broken the bond between the Tsar and the people irrevocably. The fear and respect is just being replaced by pure fear and almost in hatred in a lot of ways. The people are also gaining some political freedoms like free speech, and they don't want to lose those, so they're going to let him survive for now and see what happens as they kind of build. They're more inclined towards social reform than liberal reform, as the Liberals had let them down after October when they just hadn't really done anything that was useful. After 1905, the appalling living and working conditions and the lack of dignity becomes more intolerable as things go on. The landowners start to notice the mood of the peasants had changed, and that they're basically no longer being given a place of respect, but actually they're really very obviously hated and resented, no matter what they do. And everything in Russia now hinges on this idea that Nicholas will act. And he will take the chance to restore the relationships with his people, do what he had promised in the manifesto, give them the things that they are asking for, and make a step towards a more democratic Russia. He can still stay in charge, they're happy for that, but they want change, and he must change, and he's promised he will change. So was it really a revolution? Some historians will say no. It's simply a part of the build-up to 1917. It's part of a kind of a foundation point. And this is partly due to Lenin's description of it, of 1905 being known as a dress rehearsal for this kind of main event that would later take place. So in a lot of ways, Lenin's view on this has kind of maybe distorted what we see as what could have been an initial revolutionary point. Through historiography, we obviously take into consideration what the people that come later have said, and that is generally what he describes it as, and that is what it becomes known as. So it's actually very difficult now, because the records are so spotty and difficult to kind of see whether or not this is the case, whether it was to be a revolution but no one came forward to kind of lead it, or they just didn't know what direction to go into, if it was half-hearted, or if it was, as Lenin describes it, this dress rehearsal. Some people would argue it's not really a revolution because no fundamental changes have actually taken place. Other historians like Abraham Asher, again fantastic historian to go and check out, he claims that there's actually a really good case for considering it as a revolution, because the challenge to the establishment is a mass movement and political protest happens, which impacted more of Russia going forward. So he argues that actually this is what a revolution should have been and what it should have looked like. He goes on to argue that if the unrest had all occurred at the same time, then the government would have fallen. If the army hadn't been kind of flip-flopping on sides and the Tsar hadn't kind of kept them there, then if we have the peasants, the workers, and these kind of intelligentsia all happening at the same time, things would happen. The people are actually trying to bring about real change at the time, not in 1917. They're not looking at it thinking, well, we'll do this now, but we'll get 6 to 8 sort of years later, and in 1917 the revolution gets delivered. It's not kind of the Amazon Prime of revolutions. It is them trying to make real change in 1905, trying to get something then, not for their ancestors and not further down the line. What 1905 did do was it opened up several paths and possibilities, including more democratic government through elected Dumas and political parties, and expansion of civil rights, which were all alternatives to autocratic rule, which is something that they want changed. So if it wasn't a revolution, what else was it? Even if it was unfinished, even if it didn't actually complete all its goals, it did make a fundamental change. And if you think back to the very first lesson, and I asked you to think about what a revolution actually was, I want you to think about whether or not this actually ticks all of those boxes in the lists that you made. Do you think this is a revolution or not? So this is something that you can put into the team. I just want you to say yes or no, and why you maybe think that. It doesn't have to be too detailed. Just have a bit of a discussion about it, see what you think. Revolution or not? So, in summary, beginning of the 20th century, Russia's undergoing this rapid social and economic change, and old societal relationships are breaking down. Deep depression that starts in 1900 onwards makes life worse, and a lot of discontent is growing for the workers and peasants. Opposition from the intelligentsia to what they see as an incompetent and outdated style of government starts to grow. The war with Japan is disastrous, and the government is looking increasingly vulnerable and weak. Bloody Sunday then sparks off a series of strikes, uprising, demonstrations and disturbances, and the Tsar and his government lost control of the country for most of 1905, not 1095 as that says on the slide, so apologies for that. By October, a general strike put the regime under a lot of pressure, but the Tsar manages to rein it back by getting the October Manifesto together, and he agrees to make concessions, notably an elected Duma and civil rights, whereupon the liberals stop supporting revolution, as did the middle classes, the people with money, the people financing it, because that's what they wanted. The government arrested leaders of the workers' movement in St. Petersburg, and they crushed the armed uprising in Moscow because the army then joined sides with the Tsar again. Throughout 1906 then, troops are being used to suppress the peasants in the most brutal way possible, and the national minorities as well, and they slowly start to claw back control. The events of 1905 are a watershed moment in history. In that point, attitudes towards the Tsar's regime change irrevocably, and ultimately, though the Tsar had maintained his control, he had lost a lot more than that. He'd lost respect from all the different sections of his society, and he had lost time to see what they would do. He now had promised to change, which he would have to try and actually do. There's a lot of debate over whether or not 1905 deserves to be called a revolution or not, but it did open alternatives up to the autocratic rule at the time. So, a lot of tasks and things for you to do. You don't have to send them in. The only thing that I'm kind of looking for is your opinion. Was 1905 a revolution, yes or no, and why you think that, and this as well. So if you go to this website, politicalcompass.org, there is a quick online test for you to take to work out where on the political spectrum of 1905 you would have been. So which group would you have been campaigning for? So your two tasks then for this particular lesson is to tell me what you think of 1905 and to take the test and let us know where you are on the spectrum and how you maybe feel about that. No assignment tab, just 2 posts on the team about what you think and where you are on the political spectrum. Thanks for listening, guys. Any questions or any comments that you need to make or things you want to discuss, give me a yell, post something in the team. I'm happy to talk about it, but obviously that's what the team's there for, to start discussions. And let me know if you have any questions or you need any more information.